You're listening to a podcast from 702.
You're with Clement Manyathela.
702.
All right, it's 8 minutes after 10 o'clock now. I want us to have a serious but also frank conversation amongst ourselves, right? I want us to talk about the project of decolonizing the mind. Colonialism and apartheid have done unimaginable damage to our psyche, damage to our culture, our identity, our history. I mean, imagine a group of people just taking over the land and imposing their own culture on indigenous people for hundreds of years, making them believe that they are worthless, right? They're useless. That affects how you think about yourself. That affects how you think about others. That affects your consciousness and your view of the world. And that may make you, as a black person, believe that you are inferior. That can make you, as a white person, believe that you are superior. So I want to ask the black and white listeners this morning, what are you unlearning? Because we are all the product of society. We are the product of education, product of history, which for the longest time was rooted in colonialism and apartheid. And I believe that the burden of justice must not be placed on the victim. That's why I want white people to also say, what is it that they're unlearning? Do you know what you are required to unlearn? For instance, there's no point of us unlearning if you, colonialism and apartheid, what it's done to you is make you think and affect your psyche in a way that you think you're inferior, right? If that's what it's done to you, it won't help us having a conversation about unlearning our inferiority complex when white people still believe they are superior. And we often talk about this idea of it takes a village to raise a child, right? But have we considered how the village itself was raised and what lessons that village is giving to the child that it's raising? Because the village in this context was not immune from the effects of colonialism. So if we are serious about unlearning things and decolonizing the mind, we must go inside ourselves first and then teach the village. I'm going to be taking your calls on 011-883-0702. I want you to be the driver of this conversation. On WhatsApp, we're on 072-702-1702. You can send your SMSs as well on 31702. How do we regain our identity? How do we regain our cultural and intellectual heritage that we've lost to colonialism and apartheid? I've got two guests who are going to be guiding us through this discussion. We've got Mkhulu Nsingiza, who's the CEO of the Zinzi Mandela Foundation, Kemet historian and student of the Credo Mutwa African philosophy. Mr. Nsingiza, thank you so much for making time.
Togoza.
We also have Dr. Ndumiso Dladla, who's a senior lecturer at the Department of Jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Dladla, thank you so much for making time. Good morning.
Thank you for having me in the studio, Clement.
So, I don't even know where we need to start, Mr. Nsingiza. Maybe let's start with the effects, right? Because when we talk about apartheid and colonialism, sometimes the first things that come to your mind is, the economy, and how it's structured, and of course that's correct. But we often take for granted the impact on our psyche, the impact on our culture, the impact on our identity. So speak us through the effect of colonialism and apartheid on who we are as Africans and as a people generally.
Yes. It has a very negative, effect on our psyche. A lot of us, come to this new, so-called new dispensation with the idea that, it's a new dispensation and, what has happened, the trauma that we experience. There was never a moment that we actually take time to actually deal with the trauma that, we experienced in the past. And what makes it worst is for us to retain the structure that was responsible for our colonization. The Republic of South Africa is that structure, and when you talk about colonization, it will never end because that structure, the Republic of South Africa, came with a Western culture that seem to dominate the African culture in an African country. So that then becomes very difficult for us to actually deal with that situation, because we are confronted with that issue on a daily basis, whereby, as an example, why are we still using a calendar that is based on the northern hemisphere, whilst we are on the southern hemisphere? We need to resuscitate the calendar that we used before colonization here, a calendar that was directly linked to nature. So those are the things, that we need to deal with, and we need to acknowledge that we are on the wrong path. Starting with the calendar, because whoever decides your time controls your mind. When we kneel at the wrong time as African people, because in the southern hemisphere when it's winter, in the northern hemisphere it's summer. It's the opposite. It means it has been twisted. So that is why we will keep praying and praying, and the thing that the Creator doesn't hear our prayers. We kneel at the wrong time. Why? Because we're still using the colonial calendar.
So, Mr. Dladla, Dr. Dladla, if we are going to even get to the part where we even have conversations about how we even change things like that calendar, things like how we do certain things, the work starts within ourselves. Where do we even start that project of decolonizing the mind?
I think it's important to focus on the fact that the conquest of the mind is part and is not separate from the conquest of the body. So the process of subduing a people and assuming the title to their territory and converting them into subjects is a violent physical process that requires death, chaining of people. But in order to sustain those relations of domination, the colonial conqueror was required to produce systems which would make the subjects acquiesce, So if you read a typical history of South African law, it may begin, what was taught in law schools a few decades ago, by establishing the general history. Firstly, by establishing, for instance, and you might see this in advertising, like in a Nando's advert about who belongs in South Africa and who doesn't. So the first claim is that, so-called Bantu-speaking people are not indigenous people of the country. They're reforming of history. For a long time, a lot of Afrikaans people, for instance, still believe this, So the question about whose title, whose territory South Africa is one which is not by any means settled, even if you speak to the average person. This is a result of a very specific and deliberate process of conditioning people to accept the current relations of domination. So we could change, to free your mind when your body is enslaved, I think doesn't make any sense, because in the current condition we are in, South Africa is still a successor in title to a colonially conquered state. We've had successive constitutions, a supposedly new one, but the foundations, the right of white people to own property here and to enjoy the power which they do, is founded on what they call the right of conquest. So this is how they acquired this legitimate. So without challenging the basis of even the distribution of property in the country right now, and beginning with our minds. Because if you go outside, black people have shorter life expectancy. Black people live in dirty places. Black people are likely to be less literate. These are politically produced conditions. So you can say, I'm black, I'm beautiful, I'm free, I'm equal, but yet you are confronted with a picture outside where black people are subjugated and, correspond with a theory which you find in the book about our inferiority. So part and parcel of the process is making people understand that we are not even physically free. Forget about the mind. We are not even physically free.
Yeah. But how do we start that project of being physically free? Because I could argue that I don't have much control over that. I vote for a government hoping that they are going to bring about true redress, and they are going to, ensure that as an indigenous person in this country, as a black person, I'm not a second-class citizen like I used to be. So that power is with them. So while I wait for them to do the right thing, what do I do about the complex that I have in this society that for hundreds of years has told me you are subhuman, you are inferior, and you have no right to exist?
Well, the immediate thing, which needs to be done both individually and collectively. The purpose of Black consciousness was to begin with mental liberation, firstly by understanding that the current arrangement of power is by no means natural. Blacks do not die earlier than whites on average because it is in their being. It is because of a political system which continues to date that this is the case. So first, realizing why things are arranged in the way that they are, why the standards of beauty. So the question of studying the conditions as they currently exist, but with view to realizing that we are, that the idea that the struggle for liberation ended in 1994 or 1990 is rather false, and in fact, those who are presented or even sometimes think of themselves as losers won, so they won at the table of the negotiated settlement and got to keep the spoils of conquest. In fact, even get more following that process. So recognizing this trick, this lie, which has continued a system which both predates apartheid and has survived it, that is colonial conquest. From 1652 until 2022, we have successive regimes, legal and political regimes, which have the same end in mind, which is the maintenance of this disparity in power relations. So first, opening one's mind to this, that just because you can walk to places now, it doesn't mean that you are simply able to do so. You are free to be wherever you wish to be, but you've got to have some stuff in order to get there. So the political conditions are the most pressing issue for me, that people need to realize that, of course, we're not physically free. It's not just that we burn our hair, or we break ourselves to speak like them and to be like them. We are also at the physical level simply not free,
Yeah, and the shame that we sometimes feel when we can't even quote unquote speak like them, and which is where I want us, Mr. Nsingiza, let's look at the practical things then that we can do. And I'll take voice notes as well and calls. 011-883-0702, 072-702-1702. What are you practically doing to unlearn things, to decolonize your mind? As a black person, we went through hundreds of years, right, of constantly being treated as second-class citizens. Our identity was affected, our culture, our history. And you could make an argument that even our proper history is not being properly told today. How has that impacted you? And how are you unlearning all of those things that those ruthless systems of apartheid have sort of pushed on your psyche? What do we do, Mr. Nsingiza? What are the practical things to start unlearning as individuals, whether you are black or a white person? Because if you live in this country and you understand the context, you know that the reason we are where we are here is because of what happened during colonization. It's because of what happened during apartheid. So individually, what can we do and what can we start unlearning?
Thokoza, I think we as black people, the first thing that we need to do, we need to work towards uniting black people outside politics and religion, because in that way we'll be able to deal collectively with all the challenges that we face. And currently, we at the Zinzi Mandela Foundation, we formed a movement called the Great Empire of Kemet. This is where we are practicalizing. We are actually bringing the ancient knowledge system back, re-teaching that to the rest of the community. That is one. And secondly, we are leaving the calendar, because our calendar, the Kemet Royal Calendar, that we are promoting, it's the original calendar because it is based on the calendar that is the oldest stone calendar, in the world, that is there in Mpumalanga. So these are the practical things, because we see the calendar as a practical instrument to unite, all, black people, because that is what we need. With all the fragmentation that we have, which are sometimes induced by other religion and politics, we'll never get to the solution, because we will always, our opinions and, ideas, will always, be scattered, not a coherent, vision that we all follow, because this affects all Africans, all over the continent, because the same thing that happens in Egypt, Ghana, Ethiopia, the very same structure, the colonial structure, is still, well alive even here. Remember, even this structure was, appointed by the UN in 1974 as a crime against humanity. So that structure is still well and alive today. So this is what we need to deal with. And we cannot just, destroy the structure. We've got to set up a parallel system as African people, so that, because we are the majority. Once we can get an economic, muscle in the continent, an economy that is, controlled by African people, like here in South Africa, there's no black economy. You hear there's a Jewish economy, the Indian economy, the Chinese economy, but there's no black, economy. Why? Because we have been turned into a community of consumers. We don't produce anything. If something were to happen in South Africa now, we'll be in a very, 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 a serious, a mess, because there's nothing that we produce. If white people were to live here, some of us will actually beg them to stay. Why? Because we want them to feed them, to feed us. So that is not a, attitude that we need to have. There's so much we can create one of the most, powerful economic bloc if we were to unite and start feeding ourselves and clothing ourselves as well. I think those are the things, that will lead to change.
Yeah, and I want us to also drill much on at the individual level. For instance, I've got a message from Kabelo who says, Clement, I don't practice my African culture because it's obscure and was never taught to me. Instead, I'm interested in learning Western culture. How come a minority was able to conquer majorities all over the world, including South Africa? And that's the impact that colonialism and apartheid has had, that now people don't really know who they are. They don't have their links to their African roots, because everything has just been westernized. So this person on Twitter, Kabelo, saying African culture and practicing it is possibly the beginning of him learning and embracing who he really is and his identity. I want to quickly go to Joe in Joburg. Joe, you calling from Joburg. Good morning.
Good morning, Clement. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm fine. A very interesting topic. But the most important thing that we need to know is that oppression manifests itself in different ways. And part of it, in order to maintain it, in order to make sure that it is covered, in other words, to show that it is a substance, it has to be internalized. That is why we are talking about internalized oppression. Steve Biko was very, very poignant in his statement. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Yeah. Internalized, he was talking to internalized oppression. Internalized oppression is the takeover of a person's cognitive, affective, and behavioral dimensions. Those are very important issues. So what disappoints me is that when we took power in 1994, we did not take that into account. The fact that in order to disabuse black people of their inferiority and disabuse white people of their superiority, we need to come up with a coherent plan. It has to be in the curriculum. It has to be in civic education. It has to be everywhere. But there is nothing that this government has done, the ANC government, other than to make sure that black people are reclaiming their own identity. And then one other, I had the speaker saying that black people are in majority. That is a distorted view of majority. Majority is not about the numbers. Majority is about power. Power is about distribution of resources. Power is about whose identity is being affirmed while people are in majority, we need to make sure that we put that across to everybody. So that's something very much important. Curriculum, you start with the curriculum, you start with the mind. Black consciousness is guiding us in that particular instance.
Yeah, Joe. And I mean, how far are we, in fact, in even changing our curriculum? Let's go to Michael in Randburg. Michael, what do you want to say? Hi.
Hi, how's it? Listen, I think the first thing you got to do if you want to decolonize, you got to take out the colonizers' language. And the most thing that we are doing in this country is we're keeping English alive. You shouldn't do that. You should have no English curriculums, and all the schools should be done in the black languages, not in English. Once you got English there, every morning when you wake up and you speak English, you're colonized because you're keeping their language alive. Therefore, you can never get out of colonization. You get rid of their language. You take all the countries in Europe that were colonized. The first thing they did, they took out the colonizers' language. They did schools in their own language. I mean, you've got 3 black people in your studio with you. What are you doing? You're speaking English.
You're speaking English.
A black audience.
Yeah, because that's how the system is structured, Michael. Dr. Ndladla, let me bring you in there. You know, I mean, Michael says take on the colonizers' language. Is it as easy as that? I mean, imagine we now decided, let's just speak our home language. The structure of the station it's an English medium station, so there's a level of responsibility to do so. When you go for an interview, you can't go there and speak your home language, and that disadvantages if you look at even people in the rural areas. And I spoke about this last week, where there's some of us who come from the villages where we don't have the strong command of this language. So we don't have access to even the opportunities. It's some of us that are lucky to be given platforms on stations like this that are English medium radio stations, but we grew up not speaking this language. So when you come and you do an interview, they listen to you speak, they're like, no, this one won't be able to hold conversations here. We can't put him on air because he doesn't speak good English. And those things really disadvantage us. So is it as easy as that, Doctor, that just change the language?
Yeah, no, I suppose, what I've been trying to point out by focusing on the question of relations of power is that the change of behavior or perspective on the part of an individual can only be effective if it directs itself to the ultimate aim of a physical challenge, because the system we're dealing with is erected on the basis of an actual physical rather than simply a psychological violence. And so, I mean, black consciousness is interesting from a historical point of view because Biko and his colleagues began as members of a supposedly non or multiracial organization. And what they discovered when they were members of NUSAS was that because of the fact that white students who were part of the organization had a superior command of their language, it was their language, blacks would often subdue themselves and hold back in their statement of the problems that they were experiencing. So a meeting would end and 3 priorities facing students would come out, and it was articulated through the perspective of whites. And so they thought, in order for black people to regain their confidence, they need to be isolated from the enemy, as well as the rules, playing on the rules of the enemy. And they began to organize a blacks only movement with the purpose not simply of staying and being kumbaya, but of challenging ultimately for political power. But there's nothing which has threatened whites more than black organizations which organize on a strictly black basis. And as a result of this, of course, there were political challenges in the 1980s of physical violence in the elimination of Azapo, by supposedly non-racialists who then won the day at the negotiating table.
Yeah, we'll pick up from this, Dr. Ndladla. I'm late for news. So let's take the latest in Eyewitness News headlines. When we come back, we'll pick up from this point.
Let's walk the talk.
This is Clement Manyathela
on 702.
It's 23 minutes before 11 o'clock. We're having a conversation about the project of decolonizing the mind. You must not take for granted the damage that colonialism and apartheid have done to your psyche, to your culture, to your identity, to your history. And what I'm asking you this morning is, what are you unlearning? We are the product of the society. We are the product of those systems that we experience. So what are you unlearning? We started a conversation earlier around even English as the language that we're constantly using. Someone on Twitter says, hi Clement, interesting topic. You're speaking truth to something I've always held dear. This is why eyami ingane ikhuluma ulwimi eyalingcela ebeleni, and why it irks me when I have to speak English to another black person, as basic a language as English is. So that's Godezdo on Twitter, who says her son or her child speaks their mother tongue at home, and it just irks her as the mother when she has to speak English to another black person. And there are other people, right? There are other parents who actually still think, their kids must speak this language at home because they think that's a measure of how intelligent they are. Yeah? There are homes where you go in and kids are just speaking English. And parents are comfortable with that. And the kids, they cannot even understand. They don't know their mother tongue. And parents are like, they think to them, that's a measure of how smart the kids are. Let me go to some voice notes and then I'll go back to my guests. I've got Mkhulu Nsingiza and Dr. Ndumiso Dladla in studio. Let's start with this voice note.
Good morning, Clement. Very good topic, pertinent topic. Niklas Bauer here. There's a lot of things that black people need to unlearn. Apartheid is something that was extremely physically brutal and psychologically brutal as well. But alongside that, there's a lot of things that white people need to unlearn. One of the most basic things is, a lot of the interactions that white people have up to this day, almost 3 decades into democracy, with black people is one of servitude. Domestic worker, housekeeper, gardener, people pumping their petrol, someone at the tills at a supermarket. And I think that it's almost like hardwired into many white people's psyche that is a black person's place. Servitude. Not saying all white people. I know a fair amount of white people will get touched in their studio by a blanket statement like that. But, ask yourself a simple question as a white person. What effort have you taken to become part of the new South Africa? Culturally. And for me, one of the most important things, linguistically. I think it is shocking that white people are okay with black people always needing to be the ones that need to speak a language that's not their own in order to interact with the world. English is the most dominant language in South Africa. And Afrikan still holds a hell of a lot of power as well. And the fact of the matter is that as a black person, you need to speak those languages if you want to access opportunities. And white people, we're spoiled. We can just speak our English and our Afrikaans and make no effort whatsoever to try and learn even just greetings. Haibo, abelungu. Sizozama kancane, man.
So, and there's this saying, Dr. Nsingiza, where some black people are even scared to speak their mother tongue in front of white people because they feel, oh no, they're going to feel like they are excluded from the conversation. Sure. And I once asked the question, think about, if you're a white person today, think if you are in a group of people and you're having a conversation, imagine if they switched to Sepedi or they switched to Xhosa. How does that make you feel? And then use the same thing to look at the scenario, which is a reality for many people today, that they constantly have to speak. The person who works with you in your household, they must learn English. They're accommodating. And when we talk about privilege, that's also privilege because you don't get to go and learn this foreign language. It's there. It's other people that have to do it, and you get accommodated and you benefit from it. So how do we deal with something like that where, English is dominant. You've got to speak it to access opportunities. Yes. And sometimes we're just scared to even speak our mother tongues when we are in a group because we're thinking, oh, but there's that white person. Are they going to understand where I'm coming from? Are they even going to understand what we're talking about?
I think it will be a very challenging, task for us to deal with that, because the government that we voted promotes, this language. Parliament operates on the basis of, this foreign language. So each and every, it goes to the psyche of a black person to say that English is the language that I need to learn for me to be successful, in this environment. So it starts with politicians. We need to decolonize the minds of politicians, because they are messing up future generations. And also, for us to have a long-term solution to this, we need to deal with the structure of the Republic of South Africa. Remember that the governing system of the continent, of course. So somehow we need to resuscitate that, so that, we are able to fully express who we are. This structure or the governing system that we have, it has certain boundaries. You cannot go beyond certain boundaries. And, for us to be able to fully express ourselves, our culture, our religion, our spirituality, we need to revive our own governing system.
Are we giving ourselves that space, Dr. Lala, to even express ourselves? And I say that even amongst ourselves as black people, because sometimes, you butcher this English language. And some of the first people that come after you are black people. Like, why did you mispronounce this?
Like
but a white person comes on this station and they say, Mkhulu Manyathela. You don't see people making noise about it because it's okay for a white person to butcher a Zulu name, to butcher. But you as a black person, how dare you butcher an English word? So sometimes, are we enemies of ourselves, Doctor?
Yes. I mean, it takes us back to the question, the basic, short historical account I was trying to provide about the black consciousness movement's decision to pull out of white society, if you will, and to form an independent black group with the purpose of resuscitating black esteem, but with the ultimate end of using that resuscitation in order to challenge the relations of power and to rearrange them at the level of state. The danger of individualizing the problem is that it turns it into an ethical and psychological thing, which a person can change simply by changing themselves. But, even if a white person learns how to speak our languages and speaks them, the world of academic publishing, for instance, or the languages of international trade don't change because of your changes in your mind. Those are relationships which have been formed through the arrangements of power. So sometimes the focus on the individual esteem can come at the expense. You teach your children your language. That's an important thing to do, for a human being's development and self-understanding. But it needs to be directed at the political and power origins of these relations of power. And I'm suggesting that, if we study the process of the negotiated settlement, if we study, for instance, the white referendum of 1992, a lot of white people in racist ways may say, we voted to end apartheid, and look what you guys are doing now. If you examine the white referendum of 1992, de Klerk asked whites to authorize him to negotiate with the ANC. And he said he needed a strong mandate in order to do that. But together with the white corporations that operated in South Africa, they encouraged whites to give them that mandate and promised two things. The first thing de Klerk promised was that they would eliminate parliamentary sovereignty and replace South Africa with a constitution, with constitutional supremacy. The second thing which they would do is guarantee the right to private property. Now, these are the two main reasons for which this historical process has taken place. The deforming of our minds is only for us to accept that process which took place and to assist, to extract it using our labor. But this is the main ends.
Yeah.
He guaranteed whites that he would keep everything that they had for them and change the system of law so that blacks could not, in the same way that whites had done before, use popular sovereignty. They could not use their popular power through elected representatives to make laws and say, okay, we're taking it back today, let's vote, it's done. They would install a system which would subdue their ability to exercise their freedom. So when we don't focus on the foundations of these power relations, which, what happens is that we can massage ourselves and increase our esteem and wear our dashikis, but the order of the power structure of South Africa remaining the same. So this resuscitation of esteem needs to be directed towards the political origins. And the Black Consciousness Movement and the PAC, for instance, recognized this very early. That's why the ANC existed from 1912 until the late 50s without ever being banned by the state. The PAC existed for less than a year, and its first realm of action led to the banning of the liberation movement, and people were shot despite having no weapons themselves. And it was never understood why were these people killed, at Sharpeville. It was because Sobukwe had understood the origins. The very basis of white power is quite imaginary, and he encouraged black people to challenge this by simply not complying and being subjects anymore. By burning their passes, they could prove that whites cannot dominate them without their own consent. That was the Positive Action Campaign's purpose, that if they arrest us all, who's going to dig their gold? Who's going to clean their kitchens? If black people refuse to cooperate, this thing stops right now. And the Boer has understood this very well. But,
yeah, I wanted to go to Thabo. Some calls now and some voice notes coming through. Thabo, you're calling from Snake Park. Good morning. What do you want to say?
Good morning to you, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I would like to thank Mkhulu and the great teacher Mkhulu Nsingiza for the opportunity of being on the radio and giving us this knowledge that we need to have. My point is decolonizing of the mind of the black people. It's gonna have to be black people doing it on their own for themselves, without the involvement of any white people, because we are trying to sabotage ourselves in a new South Africa that it doesn't work, and it will never ever work until black people make sure that they get rid of white people somehow and stay in their country to rebuild their own life by doing for themselves, planting food for yourself, buying and selling for each other, and creating this economy that will grow your own people and the nation. Teach these things to the children through education.
So dependency. So when you say get rid of white people, are you saying stop the dependency? What do you mean by that, Thabo?
There is nothing that can beat that. Nature will also provide the necessary equipment and information that we can use. By doing for ourselves, we have conquered everything. Leaving white people, not being involved, because they are working through our subconscious mind, remember. They are not only working with our mind.
All right, Thibo in Snake Park. I'll get the guest to respond to that. Thank you for calling us. Sonny, you are in Kempton Park. Good morning.
Hello, good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you? Go ahead.
I'm okay, sir. I just want to say is this. In terms of what you guys are saying this morning, it's a very good and very interesting program that you guys are doing this morning. But my own contribution is this. What are the things we black people are doing to help ourselves? That is the first thing we need to ask ourselves. Do we really love ourselves as a black nation? Because one is this. As a Clement, you work in 702 and you have a good program. I'm supposed to come out as a black person and say, Clement, you're doing a good job. If you are doing the wrong thing, I'm supposed to tell you, Clement, you are doing the wrong thing. Now, the biggest issue is this. That is why sometimes if you listen to me on 702 or my Facebook, you follow them, say,
oh, Sonny,
to have been supposed to be.
Yeah.
Look at African Union. Let's go to African Union. A continent like Africa is supposed not to even go to any European country or IMF or any organization to borrow money. Look at what was during this COVID period. The president of South Africa went to some loan. The rate they are giving to him is what is different from what they are giving to the European countries.
No, I've got you, Sonny. We need to be also self-dependent. More voice notes also that have come through.
The simplest thing is to just go back to the African calendar, and through it you get to know who you are, your latent and patent talents and skills that you were born with. And from there, it's easy to see Sindizi, and go back to oneself. And once you unlearn from all of the colonistic education, cultures, and so forth, what is left is just the language, and then we are good.
Hi, Clement. Interesting conversation. Something I'd love to hear your guest's view on, the issue of language in South Africa. It's a particular bugbear of mine, and I'm sure with other people, that after 400 years plus in this country, the majority of white people don't think it's an imperative for them to learn at least one of the indigenous languages. And somehow we continue to get amused every time we hear a white person speaking Zulu or speaking Sotho as if they're doing something particularly amazing. And no one really wants to talk about this.
Yeah, and we praise them. They just say, Unjani, ooh, and then we clap. Ooh, oh my God. Wow, you said Unjani. And that's the privilege that we continue to show them, because we're saying, oh, you just learned one word? That is the biggest thing ever. So it's not an expectation. They don't think that is something that is good to do, that is required in order to coexist, because we need to coexist. And in coexisting, your culture, your language mustn't be more superior than mine. But if we are really serious about coexisting, let's learn about each other's cultures and coexist in that space. Here's the last voice note.
Good morning, Clement. Tato from Brett. Clement, being born in the 80s, we were born into this colonization, and it is so bad that I even went and took my kids to an Afrikan school, because I felt for them to be able to interact holistically, because we speak Setswana Kontlong, and they learn Afrikaans Kolong, and they learn English from everywhere basically. So for me, it has become that problem that for them to be able to stand in our country, they needed to know all languages, and it's difficult. It couldn't be that they could only speak Setswana and then they will be able to interact with the world. It's a difficult one.
No, they wouldn't be able to do that. Mr. Nsingiza, your last message on how people can decolonize the mind. I read Frantz Fanon's book, yes. Black Skin, White Mask, which really helped me a lot, because I used to be here on the radio and you butcher an English language, an English word, and I used to go home and I would feel so depressed because I feel that was the biggest failure of my life. And after I read the book, it really taught me a lot about not feeling ashamed. I've got nothing to feel ashamed about. You butcher something, learn the correct one, move forward. And those are some of the things that I've learned about just appreciating myself and regaining my true identity, not the identity that's been imposed on me by that system. What's your message to people on how they can decolonize their mind?
I think, the most important thing starts with the calendar, because time determines everything. If you are using a wrong calendar, then that will perpetuate, that colonization. And also, we would like to encourage the kings and queens of our country to stand up and fight for their people, because had they been actively involved in this, struggle, we would have maintained our languages. They would have, made sure that in Parliament, at least one of the African language, is used there. So if the kings are there in Parliament and agreeing, even them speaking English, in public. We've never seen, a king from China speaking English or Japan speaking English, in public.
Dr. Lala, your last words on I know you've spoken around the structure that even if you speak your language, but if your body is still enslaved. But what are the beginning things that people need to do? Because getting there in where we change the structure, it's going to take some time.
Yes, okay. So just a small example. If one went to China today, one would not be able to get by without learning Chinese. This is not because one is being nice to the Chinese or trying to learn about the Chinese culture. It's simply impossible to exist in China without Mandarin. Why is that? Why is that? It's because Mandarin is not an afterthought to be included by the Chinese people. It's the very foundation of their society. And anyone who moves there and wishes to do business there, wishes to understand things there, wishes to read books there, will be faced with a very difficult problem. So the power of English is simply not so great there because of the organization and relations of power. So once you convert it into an ethical problem, it leaves it at the basis of an individual to be good. But the point is that because our languages have no power, they are not attended to by practical values that if I learn isiZulu, I'll be able to do this and that. So it becomes a question of so but what people can do, I guess, is to, I would suggest, to study history. I'll give you a reference. If people can go onto Google and Google the Azanian philosophical tradition, what they would find is a special issue of a journal called Theoria, which we edited about a year ago, which will have a collection of essays addressing some of the things I've been talking about at the level of power.
I'm gonna remind the listeners about this after the news.